Thank you very much. It's great to be back in Liverpool. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to discuss, because we are going to discuss after I talk, the state of LGBT plus rights globally. You know, we've made enormous changes in this country. We really have moved mountains, but in many parts of the world, the battle has only just begun. So this year, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, we must remember that our experience in the West is often not replicated in non-Western countries, even though in many of those countries great gains have been made. So I think about it, you know, Argentina and Uruguay had same-sex marriage before the UK. So sometimes the tables are turned. Sometimes countries which we perhaps don't think of as being so progressive are actually ahead of us. When that queer uprising began in New York in 1969, little did we know the impact it would have globally over the subsequent decades. You know, what began in June 1969 was a riot against police harassment by queer people who were fed up with being pushed around. They sent a signal not only across the United States, but all across the world. And of course, important though those riots were, signaling the determination of LGBT plus people to fight back against their oppressors, the real significance of the Stonewall Uprising was, of course, the formation of the Gay Liberation Front. First in New York, then in other American cities, then in Britain, then in cities across the Western world, and now in almost every country on earth. To have this phenomenal change in just the space of 50 years is quite extraordinary. When you think the decades and centuries that working class people had to wage and battle to win basic rights, when you think of the centuries that women had to fight to get basic rights, here in the West, we've achieved it in less than a century. Indeed, in half a century. Now, of course, there are still battles to be won. You know, we still don't have same-sex marriage in the north of Ireland. We still have discrimination in the asylum system against LGBT plus refugees. We still don't have mandatory LGBT plus inclusive relationship and sex education in our schools. The level of bullying in our schools means that 45% of all LGBT plus people at school say they've been bullied because of their sexuality or their gender identity. And on our streets, a third of all LGBT plus people, around about 1 million, have personally and directly themselves been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime. So the battle is not over here yet. We still have more work to do. And that, I think, is the eternal message from the Stonewall generation. Never give up. There's no room for apathy or complacency, not even in the West where huge gains have been made, but particularly on the global scale. You know, it is phenomenal to think that the first Pride parade, which grew out of the Gay Liberation Front in New York in 1970, has now become a global phenomenon in almost, well, certainly the vast majority of countries on this planet. Sometimes covertly, like in Uganda, they can't hold an open Pride parade, but they hold one nonetheless. In Iran, they can't hold Pride events, but secretly and covertly in people's homes, they hold them. This is a phenomenal, extraordinary achievement. And then think about the rainbow flag. The rainbow flag is now probably the most ubiquitous flag in the world today. It flies in, again, the vast majority of countries on Earth. Sometimes, again, not openly, because of state repression, but it's a symbol of pride and defiance, of resolve to continue the battle. And for that symbol, that beautiful coloured flag, to have spread to so many countries and be a symbol of liberation for so many hundreds of millions of people, that is a really outstanding achievement, for which all of us, here and beyond, can take some credit and pleasure. Having said all this, we have made gains, and indeed, the arc of history, as Martin Luther King once said, the arc of history bends towards justice. But it's often a tempered, uneven progress. And although many countries have criminalized same-sex relations, over 40 in the last 4 decades, still today, 69 countries have a total prohibition on homosexuality. It has traditionally been a prohibition on male homosexuality, but there's an increasing trend in those homophobic, biphobic and transphobic nations to also criminalize female homosexuality. So more than half of those 69 countries criminalize both male and female homosexuality. And although in very few countries transgenderism is a crime, other laws are used, public morality laws, for example, are used to criminalize trans people as well. And in the recent years, we have seen, sadly, a growing backlash in about 20 or 25 countries. Now that is a small number, given that there are 193 countries on Earth. But it's still a very worrying trend. That backlash, we've seen it in Uganda, Iraq, Malaysia, Brunei, Syria, Nigeria, Russia, and particularly, of course, in Russia's Chechen Republic. And this backlash has included 2 things. First of all, the more vigorous enforcement of existing laws which criminalize same-sex relations, which has resulted, for example, in escalating arrests in countries like Tunisia, Cameroon, Egypt, and Senegal. But also, what is particularly surprising about this backlash is that it has taken place in some countries which have previously, until the last few years, have had no history of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic persecution. I'm thinking about Tanzania, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. In Tanzania, as you probably know, the governor or the mayor of Dar es Salaam, the capital, ordered the police to identify and round up and arrest all known LGBT people. Simultaneously, or shortly beforehand, the government there had banned a whole group of HIV advocacy organizations on the grounds that they were promoting homosexuality by giving safer sex advice and condoms to people who were LGBT. They've even gone as far in Tanzania to ban the importation and sale of lubricant on the ground that it is an instrument or means to encourage and promote homosexuality. In Indonesia, you've heard about the public canings, you've heard about the raids on gay bars in Jakarta. This had never previously happened in that country. It was a Muslim country, but with a fairly live and let live attitude. That is now changing as politicians and Islamist groups seek to use LGBT issues as a wedge to gain political advantage and support. But having said this, there is progress. In the last year, we've seen the decriminalization of homosexuality in India, Angola, and Trinidad and Tobago. Those battles fought there by very, very brave, courageous LGBT plus defenders and their straight allies. And before those three decriminalizations, we had decriminalization in Belize, Palau, Sao Tome and Principe, Northern Cyprus, Mozambique, Nauru, and the Seychelles. Right now, there are ongoing battles and challenges to end the criminalization of LGBT plus people in Jamaica, Botswana, and Kenya. So for those who think this is all a Western issue, we can see that in every country on earth, no matter what their political, religious, or cultural history or traditions, there is some form of LGBT activism and campaigning. I think back a few years ago to people in Sudan, a country where there is the death penalty for homosexuality. A handful of very brave LGBT plus activists decided to form an organization and to actually seek a dialogue with the government, even though presenting themselves to the government could have put them in the firing line to be arrested, put on trial, and be executed. It shows that in countries that we perhaps dismiss or don't know about, there are people carrying the torch of LGBT plus freedom, often at great personal risk and sacrifice. I mentioned that the number of countries that now still criminalize same-sex relations is down to 69. But that's still more than a third of all the countries on earth. What's more, 35 of these 69 countries are members of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, which has a charter and has passed resolutions which affirm its commitment to universal human rights, equality, non-discrimination, and personal freedom. Yet, more than half of the 53 Commonwealth member states criminalize same-sex relations. And many of these laws were, of course, imposed during the colonial era in the 19th century by Britain. When Britain colonized these countries, we exported our homophobic laws to them. We imposed on those peoples, those nations, a level of homophobia that they had never previously experienced in legal terms. Having said that, of course, these countries are now independent nations. So the question is, why are they hanging on to the anti-LGBT plus laws that were imposed upon them by the colonial power? Surely, as independent nations, they should get rid of that legislative imposition in the same way they've got rid of many other things that were imposed upon them by Britain in the colonial era. But sadly not. Several of these Commonwealth countries still today stipulate a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. Life imprisonment for same-sex relations in countries like Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Pakistan, Uganda, Bangladesh, and Guyana. There's also been, of course, new anti-LGBT plus laws enacted in some countries, such as Nigeria, which a few years ago passed new draconian legislation to not only ban same-sex marriage, which was not really a demand of Nigerian LGBTs in any case, but more significantly, to outlaw LGBT plus organizations, fundraising, and public advocacy. So in Nigeria, if you fundraise for an LGBT cause, you can get up to 7 years in jail. If you form an LGBT organization or are a member of an LGBT organization, you can get up to 7 years imprisonment. If you advocate for LGBT plus equal rights, you can get 7 years imprisonment. So we can see that some countries are going backward. If we look at the social consequences, we can see it isn't just about law, it's also about public institutions, values, and attitudes. So we see an escalation of anti-LGBT prejudice and even hatred in many of these countries. So if the law doesn't get you, the chances are vigilantes might. So we see in countries where even the law is relatively light, we see homophobic mobs and groups targeting known or perceived or suspected LGBT people for victimization, including mob violence in the streets and the torching of their homes and businesses. We also see that in many of these backlash countries, LGBT plus people are increasingly demonized and scapegoated by demagogic politicians and fundamentalist clerics. They see this as a cheap, easy way to get public support. They play to prejudice as a means to try and win public support. So for example, 3 years ago, a spokesperson for Malawi's main opposition party, Kemasonda, sought to bolster his public profile and win bigoted votes. He said, and I quote, "Arresting them," referring to LGBT plus people, "won't address this problem because sooner or later they're going to be released on bail. The best way to deal with this problem is to kill them." Was there a huge public outcry against Ken Masonda when he said that? No. There were a handful of voices condemning his de facto incitement to murder, but most politicians and church leaders remain silent. Indeed, the Anglican churches in countries like Nigeria and Uganda have contributed to the witch hunting atmosphere. Their clerics actively speak out against the LGBT plus community. They support draconian new anti-LGBT plus legislation. They say that in the name of God, these sinners, these devil worshippers, these Satanists, meaning LGBT plus people, must pay the ultimate price. And yet, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, will welcome these leaders to Lambeth Palace for the next Lambeth Conference in 2020, as he has invited them to Lambeth Palace on many previous occasions. He seems to think that holding the Anglican Communion together is more important than the human rights of our communities. He seems to think that colluding with people who advocate our criminalization, in some cases actual violence, is the right thing to do. Now, I find it shocking that any person of faith could ever possibly condone any form of hatred, discrimination, or violence, or collude with those who do. Because welcoming these extremely homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bishops and to Lambeth Palace is a form of condonement. It's a form of collusion. It is giving them respectability. So, although we know that there are many Christians in the Anglican Communion and other denominations who reject these kind of views, and who have stood with our community, and I thank them most sincerely, we know that the leadership, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, is not giving a lead. Indeed, he has insisted that at the next Lambeth conference, that gay bishops, unlike straight bishops, are not allowed to bring their partners. That is collusion with homophobia. And not content with that, the anti-gay bishops are now demanding that the gay bishops themselves be excluded from the Lambeth conference. So you give them an inch, and they take a mile. Going back to governmental policy, I think it's certainly true that having an enemy within is a very useful way of distracting public attention from economic failings and corruption. Hitler tried it, quite successfully, sadly, with Jewish people, and LGBT, and Jehovah's Witnesses, and racial minorities, Gypsies, Sinti, and Roma. And it's being replicated in many, many countries around the world. The motivation of Ken Mashonda in Malawi was very clearly about trying to demonize a small, vulnerable, marginalized minority, so that people would focus on them and not the failings of his party or the government. I mentioned that it isn't just about law, it's also about vigilantism, about mobs or individuals who take a green light from what religious and political leaders say when they denounce us. So some of this violence is escalated to the level of death squads. So there are right-wing death squads in Honduras, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and El Salvador. In the tiny Central American country of Honduras, since 2008, over 230 LGBT+ activists have been assassinated by right-wing death squads. In Brazil, where the major cities have progressive LGBT laws, where the country has same-sex marriage, in the remote northern regions and elsewhere, death squads pursue what they call social cleansing. Among others targeted are LGBT+ people, and in particular trans people. Indeed, the Trans Monitoring Project, reporting on the situation in Latin America in general, found that between 2008 to 2014, over 1,300 trans and gender diverse men and women, and those who are non-binary, were murdered in Latin America. Over 1,300. And those are just the murders that this project was able to know about and identify. The real figure is almost certainly much higher. You may remember that last year the Singaporean courts upheld the criminalization of same-sex relations. The case was brought to strike down the British colonial era section 377 of the Singaporean Criminal Code, which illegalizes same-sex relations. But that was thrown out by the courts in Singapore. And also in the last recent years, Burundi and Chad, which never previously had anti-LGBT+ laws, they have both outlawed homosexuality for the first time in their history. We all remember the shocking news about Islamic State in Syria and Iraq targeting LGBT people or those suspected of being LGBT for execution, mostly by throwing them off tall buildings. Thankfully, the Islamic State is history, although its fighters still remain in certain pockets in both Iraq and Syria, but they don't control any more areas. And I think we need to pay tribute, in particular, to the heroic Kurdish fighters who helped liberate Iraq and Syria from Islamic State. Yeah, there were others as well, but the Kurds, with their progressive, pro-women's rights, pro-LGBT agenda, are a beacon in the Middle East, showing that it is possible in that region to have rights for women and LGBT plus people. Now, I don't for a moment say that all the Kurds are fine. You know, they come out of a long homophobic, biphobic and transphobic history. But what the Kurdish groups, particularly in northern Syria, have done in their enclave of Rojava is truly inspiring. To have the leadership welcome LGBT plus people and enshrine women's rights as a fundamental core of their democratic revolution, their liberation of Syria from ISIS, is really incredibly inspiring and moving. In Iraq, the picture is still more checkered. Although Islamic State has been defeated, and again I pay tribute to the Kurds for that, there are parts of Iraq where Islamist militias operate pretty openly, allegedly with the de facto approval of the pro-Iranian government, and they are still waging a terror campaign against LGBT plus people. Not as bad as in 2003 to 2007, not as extreme, not as frequent, but it is still happening, and it's almost unreported. As I said, there is unfinished business. But despite the bleak pockets, the overwhelming majority of the 193 countries in the world today, the trend is towards greater LGBT plus acceptance and equality. In many places, the progress is painfully slow and checkered by many obstacles and setbacks. But the trend is in the right direction. And that is solely down to those brave, heroic LGBT plus campaigners and their straight allies who've made these changes and these progresses possible. We remember that some years ago in Uganda, they proposed and passed an anti-homosexuality bill that provided for the death penalty for same-sex relations. That was eventually annulled by the courts, albeit on a technicality that Parliament was not for it. They promised a new bill to replace it, but it's never happened. And that is down to the coalition of LGBT plus groups and their straight allies. In Uganda, they have a fantastic model of solidarity and unity between diverse organizations. So there's a coalition in Uganda which comprises of LGBT plus groups, women's rights groups, trade unions, opposition parties, tribal and religious minorities. They all work together to support each other in defending universal human rights. So when the LGBT plus community is under attack, all the other organizations rally to support our community. Conversely, when women's rights are under attack in Uganda, the LGBT groups and everyone else rallies to support the women campaigners. It's a great model of successful, effective campaigning. Moving to another part of the world, Vietnam lifted the ban on same-sex marriage in 2015. It had passed a ban, but it's now lifted. And there is pressure in Vietnam, even from mainstream legislators, to eventually legislate marriage equality. In Botswana, not long ago, the courts for the first time gave official recognition to an LGBT plus organisation to be registered. And recently, the Indian Supreme Court has upheld the human rights of the trans community. Hillam, the LGBT plus group in Lebanon, has operated for over a decade. It has offices openly in Beirut. It organises public events, and it's hosted the first ever LGBT plus centre in the Arab world. Beirut Pride happens. You know, we don't think often that this might be possible, because Lebanon is not entirely easy place, because we have Hezbollah, an extremist Islamist group that is against women's rights and against LGBT plus rights. They are very powerful, but nevertheless, despite their power and influence, Hillam holds these events and Beirut Pride happens. You'll recall that some months ago, Taiwan elected its first woman president, a clear public supporter of same-sex marriage. And right now, marriage equality has the support of more than 2/3 of the public in Taiwan, and we're expecting a decision very soon on marriage equality, which would make Taiwan the first Asian nation with equal marriage. In South Africa, we've got an openly lesbian cabinet minister. In neighbouring Zambia, the government and police tried to prosecute 2 men for being gay, but they were acquitted at their trial. We look at the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has a very checkered record, and where many of the members of that body are wholly and completely unfit to be members, given their gross human rights abuses. But nevertheless, that Human Rights Council has on several occasions passed resolutions condemning violence, discrimination, and so on against LGBT plus people. Even in Africa, I say even in Africa, the African Union, the vast majority of African countries still criminalise same-sex relations. But the African Union, which represents all those African nations, has a human rights body. It's called the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And it has passed resolutions calling on member states to protect LGBT plus communities against discrimination and hate crime. So even in Africa, which we too often look at in a very homogenous, very, very one-sided way, even in Africa there are people with power and influence who are defending and supporting our communities. There's been some research by the Williams Institute in the United States, which has taken a look at global acceptance of same-sex relations around the world, including in many developing countries. In Latin America, acceptance of homosexuality now ranges from a high of 34% in Uruguay to a low of 2% in Ecuador. On legal recognition for marriages of same-sex couples, Uruguay has the highest support in Latin America with 57%, while Guatemala has the lowest level of support at 12%. In Africa, acceptance of homosexuality ranges from a high of 38% in South Africa to a low of 2% in Ghana. Now, all these figures are still way too low, but nonetheless, they are a huge improvement on the figures for a decade ago, let alone 2 or 3 decades ago. As I said, the trend of history is moving in our favour. And I think it is entirely down to the brave, determined LGBT plus campaigners, many of whom have risked their lives and liberty to make it happen. Remember David Kato in Uganda, brutally murdered. Brian Williamson in Jamaica, brutally murdered. Fanny Ann Eddy in Sierra Leone, brutally murdered, all because they stood for the human rights and dignity of LGBT plus people. So when it comes to the backlash, of course, backlash is horrible. It's so wrong. But look at it this way. If we weren't winning, there'd be no backlash. There's backlash precisely because we are winning. We're making these gains and it provokes the backlash. I'm old enough to remember the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. I can remember that when the Freedom Riders went to the Deep South to challenge segregation and the denial of voting rights to African Americans, the level of violence against Black Americans increased very significantly. And that was terrible, it was tragic. But out of that sacrifice, freedom came. Out of that sacrifice, segregation was ended. Voting rights were granted. And although there's been some rowback in recent years and Black Lives Matter has made a very, very clear and pointed and correct illumination of the progress that still has to be made, African Americans would not be where they are today without that fight and without enduring that backlash. So I take inspiration from the African American struggle and the struggle of many, many other peoples around the world. They went through backlash, but ultimately emerged victorious. Backlash is a backhanded compliment, a painful, tragic one, but a backhanded compliment that we are making gains and winning. So for me, the global trend is very clear. Queer freedom is an unstoppable global trend. And LGBT plus freedom has been long delayed, but history has already proven it cannot be denied. Thank you.